In October 2024, when the Biden administration announced the National 6G Initiative with $5 billion in funding, the press conferences celebrated American leadership, talked about innovation, about securing our technological sovereignty. But here's what those announcements didn't reveal. By the time those checks were signed, the battle was already decided. China holds 4,200 patents essential to 6G technology. That's 38% of the emerging global total. South Korea claims 1,850. Japan has 1,200, and America's contender, a consortium of tech companies, holds barely 890. The nation that created GPS, that pioneered quantum computing, that launched the semiconductor revolution, somehow stands on the sidelines of the infrastructure that will dominate the next 50 years of global dominance. This wasn't a competition America is losing. It's a competition America arrived late to join. So what's really happening? To grasp what's unfolding, you need to understand what 6G patents truly represent. They're designated as SEPs, Standard Essential Patents. These are the foundational technologies that every manufacturer must license to produce 6G equipment or connected devices. You can't engineer a 6G smartphone without them. You can't construct a 6G network without them. And if you want access, you have to compensate the patent holders. This is what I call the intellectual property monopoly. So who controls them? China dominates with 4,200 patents. That's 38% of the current total. South Korea secures second place with 1,150, roughly 17%. Japan possesses 1,200, approximately 11%. And then there's the American collective with just 890. The remainder distributed among European research centers, Canadian labs, and various smaller players. But here's what this actually signifies. Every 6G-enabled product manufactured anywhere on Earth, whether it's assembled in Texas or Shanghai or Berlin, must generate licensing payments to these patent owners. Your next-generation phone, your autonomous vehicle, your smart city infrastructure, your AI-powered wearables, every single one creates a revenue stream that flows predominantly to Chinese corporations. Consider that reality for a moment. You enter a technology store, you purchase the newest device for $2,500. A fraction of that payment, whether companies acknowledge it or not, flows into Chinese research institutions. Not because they manufactured your device, not because they designed your interface, but because they control the patents that enable 6G connectivity. This represents passive wealth accumulation on a global scale. Let me offer you a comparison. Picture if China possessed the patent to binary code. Every computer program, every digital transaction, every piece of software would owe them compensation. That's fundamentally what's occurring with 6G. This isn't merely about prestige or rankings. This concerns economic leverage that multiplies annually, generation after generation. It's about who earns the authority when the architecture for 7G gets designed. It's about who possesses bargaining power when nations negotiate infrastructure agreements. And here's the paradox nobody discusses. America pioneered satellite communications. American institutions, Bell Labs, developed the technologies that enabled wireless networks. But somehow, across just 2 technological cycles, China now commands the blueprint of tomorrow's connectivity. The patents aren't simply income, they're influence. They're positions at international standards committees. They're the capacity to determine what 6G will and won't accomplish. When Chinese researchers arrive at the International Telecommunication Union conferences, they don't merely contribute, they dictate priorities. This represents the architecture of actual dominance in the coming decades, and America occupies a secondary position. If you're as stunned as I was when these figures first emerged, hit that like button so the platform amplifies this to wider audiences, and subscribe because what follows becomes even more alarming. So how did this unfold? How did the nation that led every prior generation of wireless technology, from cellular networks to 5G deployment, somehow fall behind in 6G before the starting gun fired? The explanation isn't what you'd expect. This wasn't about technological inferiority. It wasn't about industrial espionage compromising American innovations. It was about 4 systemic failures that were completely preventable. Failure number 1, fragmented competition. In 2020, America had the building blocks. Microsoft was investing in cloud infrastructure. Google had quantum research programs. Apple was designing custom silicon. Qualcomm was developing next-gen chips. America had the pieces. But then, each corporation made the same critical miscalculation. They pursued independent strategies, competed for market share, optimized for their specific products rather than unifying around a collective goal. When American tech executives examined the 6G infrastructure landscape, they saw thin profit margins, lengthy development cycles, and frankly, it wasn't generating headlines. So they fragmented their efforts. Each company filed patents in their specific domain. No unified strategy emerged. By the time 6G standards discussions intensified, America had brilliant engineers working in isolation. When the competition accelerated, we had talented individuals but no coordinated offensive. Failure number 2, what I call the investment mismatch. In the United States, you had private companies balancing R&D spending against shareholder expectations, against quarterly performance, each calculating return on investment using traditional market metrics. Meanwhile, in China, you had state-backed research institutions with decade-long horizons, with guaranteed funding, coordinating across universities, synchronizing their patent applications, advancing toward a unified objective. The Chinese system didn't debate short-term profitability. They engineered an environment where success meant collaborative dominance. American corporations were optimizing for stock prices. China was architecting for generational control. Failure number 3, delayed recognition. In 2020, China initiated its comprehensive 6G research program. Tens of billions flowed into laboratories. Entire research cities were constructed. Engineers were recruited by the tens of thousands. The objective was explicit. We will lead 6G by 2030. And what was America prioritizing in 2020? We were managing a pandemic, we were debating stimulus packages. 6G wasn't even part of mainstream policy discussions. It wasn't until 2024, 4 full years behind, when the administration finally launched its counter-initiative, that American officials recognized we faced a strategic challenge. But by that point, the foundation was already established. The early patents were already registered. The momentum was already locked in. And failure number 4, the standards capture. Here's something most observers miss. 6G technical specifications aren't determined by market forces. They're established through consensus at the International Telecommunication Union. Researchers from participating nations convene, present technologies, and determine what becomes mandatory. In these forums, Chinese representatives control roughly 35% of the working group positions. American representatives, approximately 18%. You can't dominate a competition when your adversary shapes the regulations. By the time American diplomats arrived to raise concerns, the preliminary frameworks had already been drafted, and Chinese technologies were embedded in the foundation. These 4 failures weren't coincidental. They were the predictable outcome of a structure that emphasizes quarterly returns over strategic positioning. But here's what makes this genuinely threatening. The ramifications aren't hypothetical. They're manifesting right now. Subscribe so you catch what comes next, because the geopolitical transformation is already reshaping global power. So America trails in the patent competition. Fine, that's disappointing. Maybe it generates some licensing costs, but what's the real damage? Here's the reality. The implications of conceding 6G aren't just economic, they're civilization altering. Let me reveal 3 critical vulnerabilities that are already emerging. Vulnerability number 1, network dependency. By 2030, estimates suggest that 65% of global 6G infrastructure will utilize Chinese technology. Base stations, network cores, satellite integration systems, all manufactured and critically updated by Chinese firms with documented connections to state apparatus. Now, the debate everyone engages in is, does this enable surveillance capabilities? Can they access transmitted data? And the honest answer is we can't definitively confirm. But here's what we can verify. In 2025, the United Kingdom confronted a dilemma. The United States applied tremendous pressure. Exclude Chinese 6G providers or face repercussions. Technology sharing could be restricted. Defense partnerships could be reconsidered. And yet, the UK chose Chinese infrastructure anyway. Why? Because alternatives didn't exist. Samsung and Nokia, the Western options, couldn't compete on capability, couldn't match deployment timelines, couldn't match integration quality. Britain needed 6G to maintain economic competitiveness, and only China could deliver the complete package. That's what infrastructure dependency looks like. It's not that China coerces nations into selection, it's that viable alternatives don't exist. Vulnerability number 2, the defense crisis. Imagine a U.S. Air Force squadron coordinating hypersonic weapons using 6G. Imagine AI-driven military systems communicating across 6G networks. Imagine battlefield coordination, intelligence gathering, autonomous operations, all functioning on infrastructure that fundamentally relies on adversarial technology. Every data transmission that passes through Chinese-developed protocols is a transmission that China can theoretically monitor or disrupt. Now, Defense Department officials will argue they maintain isolated secure networks, and that's accurate. But contemporary warfare isn't purely military operations. It's civilian infrastructure enabling military capability. And when that civilian backbone is Chinese-controlled, you face a vulnerability that encryption alone can't eliminate. Classified Defense Intelligence Agency assessments from 2023 warned about precisely this scenario. The warnings were acknowledged but not adequately addressed. Vulnerability number 3, the erosion of American credibility. In 2020, the United States addressed international forums and championed digital sovereignty, about open internet architecture, about the risks of authoritarian-controlled communications. Fast forward to 2026, the U.S. advises allies, don't adopt Chinese 6G, it's a strategic vulnerability. And allied nations respond, then provide us with a competitive alternative. And America has no comprehensive answer. Canada initially resisted Chinese 6G under American influence. Then they partially reversed their position. Why? Economic mathematics. The expense of rejecting Chinese infrastructure and substituting it with less capable alternatives was economically prohibitive. When your closest allies disregard your security warnings because you can't deliver a superior solution, that's not merely policy disagreement. That's the disintegration of global leadership in real time. And here's the dimension that should concern every American. Take out your current device right now. If it's being marketed as 6G ready, examine the specifications. Chances are the connectivity module, the component that will link you to next-generation networks, will generate royalties to Chinese patent holders. You are directly financing the infrastructure of American technological subordination. So why hasn't this created a crisis moment? Why is there no dramatic policy reversal, no emergency mobilization? That's the question we need to confront next. I remember when 5G networks launched with substantial coverage. It was 2020. I was living in California, and suddenly connectivity felt revolutionary. Downloads were instantaneous. Cloud gaming actually functioned. It felt like we'd entered a new era. And we had. That era felt American. Qualcomm still maintained significant chipset market presence. Verizon and T-Mobile competed on deployment speed. Remember those advertisements showcasing 5G capabilities? That wasn't just marketing. That was American companies flexing technological muscle. The global technology community still looked to American innovation for direction. But while America was celebrating app ecosystems and debating privacy regulations, something fundamental was shifting. Something the mainstream completely overlooked. In 2020, China discreetly launched its comprehensive 6G research apparatus. Not an experimental project, not a modest university initiative, a national mobilization. By 2023, Huawei's combined 6G R&D spending alone reached $22 billion. The entire American telecommunications sector combined was allocating roughly $16 billion. This is what I call the silent technology war. Conflicts waged not through military force, but through research budgets, not with armed forces, but with doctoral researchers. And America didn't even recognize it was engaged in one. Fast forward to 2024, suddenly policymakers awaken, suddenly the administration acknowledges there's a strategic problem, the 6G initiative gets announced, the funding gets allocated, the rhetoric gets deployed, but the foundation was already constructed. South Korea faced a strategic decision, Japan faced a strategic decision, Germany faced a strategic decision, and incrementally, despite considerable American diplomatic pressure, they're integrating Chinese 6G technology, not because they trust China, not because they're indifferent to security implications, but because when you need to deploy 6G to maintain economic relevance and only one ecosystem can provide it at the sophistication and scale you require, the decision becomes inevitable. The Pentagon reached its own conclusion simultaneously. The future of warfare will operate on 6G. Swarm drones, synchronized strikes, instantaneous intelligence processing, all of it depends on ultra-low latency, high-bandwidth networks. And those networks, they're being developed in China. Now, here's the aspect that should disturb American strategists. The 7G competition has already commenced. China has filed approximately 45% of preliminary 7G patents. The United States roughly 12%. The pattern is duplicating itself in real time. The identical structural problems that caused America to concede 6G, the fragmented industry approach, the quarterly thinking, the absence of centralized coordination, all of it remains unchanged. The only difference is that this time American leadership understands what's at stake. Whether they can actually implement solutions is an entirely different question. You don't surrender a technology competition in one decisive confrontation. You surrender it in a decade of budget committee meetings where strategic priorities got deprioritized. You surrender it when your most talented engineers accept positions at social media companies instead of telecommunications firms because the compensation packages are superior. You surrender it when infrastructure is unsexy and consumer apps are glamorous. And by the time you recognize what you've conceded, the competition is finished. Let's examine the broader context for a moment because this narrative isn't really about 6G. It's about two economic philosophies competing for global dominance. The American philosophy says, empower private enterprise to innovate. Let market dynamics determine outcomes. Government should facilitate but not direct. The Chinese philosophy says the state identifies strategic imperatives, designates critical technologies, and then mobilizes comprehensive resources to dominate them. The question we must address is which philosophy prevails when the arena is infrastructure, where returns require 30-year horizons and demand massive coordinated investment. Americans frequently assert that market-driven innovation always triumphs, and in numerous sectors that's demonstrably true. If you're developing consumer applications or entertainment platforms, the American approach is unmatched. But infrastructure isn't TikTok. You can't disrupt satellite networks with a viral app. You can't move fast and break things when you're constructing the physical foundation of the quantum internet. This is what I call the innovation misconception. The belief that the same methodology that succeeds in software will succeed in hardware, that the same incentives that generated Netflix will generate 6G networks. They won't. So what options does America have? There are really only three realistic pathways. Option 1, establish a national technology champion. Consolidate Qualcomm, Intel, and emerging 6G startups into one state-backed consortium with guaranteed funding. Politically challenging in the current environment. Americans remain deeply suspicious of government-directed industrial policy. Option 2, initiate a massive federal research program, something comparable to the Manhattan Project, but for telecommunications infrastructure. Pour hundreds of billions into laboratories, subsidize commercial deployment, make 7G a presidential priority. Theoretically possible, but it requires Congress to authorize expenditures for outcomes that won't materialize for 15 years, which is an exceptionally difficult proposition in a political system structured around 2- and 4-year cycles. Option 3, acknowledge limitations. America can achieve this independently. Forge genuine partnerships with allies, South Korea, Japan, the European Union, and construct a coordinated alternative to China's trajectory. This is probably the most pragmatic path, but it demands something America historically struggles with: authentic multilateral collaboration, where we don't unilaterally dictate terms. All three options share one requirement. They demand long-term strategic planning that transcends electoral cycles, and that might represent the most difficult transformation. Here's the reality, though. There's still an opportunity. The technical standards for 7G won't be finalized until 2032. The infrastructure won't be deployed globally until the late 2030s. There remains time, but the trajectory is unmistakable. China initiated serious 6G research in 2020. By 2026, they dominate early patent filings. They started 7G research in 2024. You calculate the implications. The question isn't, can America recover? The question is, will America reform the system that created this disadvantage in the first place? Because if the same fragmented, short-term, market-optimized structure that conceded 6G is the one competing for 7G, well, you already understand how this narrative concludes. Remember what I stated at the beginning? This wasn't a competition America is losing. It's a competition America arrived late to join. The real question now is, will we show up prepared for the next one? The infrastructure of tomorrow is being architected right now. The only question is, whose vision will it materialize? If this video transformed how you understand the US-China technology competition, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share your perspective below. Do you think America can reverse this trajectory in the 7G competition, or is the pattern already locked in? Let me know your thoughts.